Section 6 of Cat Tales. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Bologna Times. Cats by Mrs. R. Lee. Section 6. Cats are diminished examples of the feline race, but their fur is longer than that of others, and they bear a greater resemblance to leopards than to lions. The idea of majesty is not connected with them, but they are celebrated for grace, elegance, suppleness, and insidiousness. There is yet a wild species in existence, which inhabits the mountainous and wooded districts of the northern part of England and also Scotland, where it used formerly to be very abundant. It is scarcely necessary to give a description even of the untamed species, so well known are the general characters of these animals. It will be quite sufficient to say that the head of the latter is triangular, the soles of the feet of the male are always black, their tails are bushy, they spring furiously upon whoever approaches, and utter unearthly cries. Mr. St. John, when walking up to his knees in heather, over broken ground, came suddenly upon a wild cat. She rushed out between his legs, every hair standing up. He cut a good-sized stick, and 3 Skye terriers gave chase till she took refuge in a corner, spitting and growling. On trying to dislodge her, she flew at Mr. St. John's face, over the dogs' heads, but he struck her while in the air, and she fell among the dogs, who soon dispatched her, even though they say that a wild cat has 12 instead of 9 lives. If one be taken, those in the neighborhood are sure to be also secured, as they will all, in the manner of foxes, assemble round the body of their relation. Domestic cats often run away to the woods, and subsist on their own hunting, but these are not to be taken for the real wild cat. The female of the latter is the smaller of the two, and retires into the fissures of rocks or takes possession of some large bird's nest when she is about to have young ones. They are found all through Germany, Russia, Hungary, and the north of Asia, where their fur is much more valued than it is here, probably on account of the length and quality of the hair. Our house cats are, by most naturalists, supposed not to have descended from the above wild species. Professor Temminck ascribes their origin to the Nubian cat found in that country by Mr. Rappel, but Mr. Bell differs from him. Cats were numerous in Egypt, where they were much prized, and honored with being embalmed. In Abyssinia they form part of a marriage dowry, for fear the mice should eat up the other portions. Nevertheless, it will be perhaps more like the truth if we give our cats an Asiatic origin. When they run wild, Mr. St. John says, they are often irreclaimable, and do incredible mischief. There are instances, however, of their returning to their homes bringing game with them. One known to the above gentleman used every winter evening to bring in a woodcock, another brought back rabbits and hares. The latter was constantly caught in traps, which accident did not cure him of his wanderings, and he never struggled, but sat quietly till someone came and effected his release. All cats sleep slightly, raise their back, bristle up their hair, and swell up their tail when angry. Those which have been domesticated are very inquisitive concerning things rather than persons, smell and inspect a new piece of furniture several times, are attached to houses, and are extremely fond of scents, especially certain kinds emanating from plants. They seldom eat the rats which they kill, although they devour mice. If they should swallow a shrew, which is very rare, they almost immediately reject it. They will sit hour after hour watching at the mouth of a hole, and, after seizing their prey, bring it to their favorites in the house to show their prowess, and strut about with a great air of self-satisfaction. They generally have a great dislike to water, but they have been known to surmount this when they could catch a fish, for which species of food they have a great preference. The accusation that they play with you one minute and scratch you the next is too true. The change is not an act of treachery, but arises from excitement. I know not whence it is derived, but for centuries cats have been connected with superstition and sorcery. They have always been regarded as attendants upon witches, and witches themselves have been said to borrow their shapes when on their mysterious expeditions. I was once told that Lord Cochrane was accompanied by a favourite black cat in a cruise through the northern seas. The weather had been most unpropitious. No day had passed without some untoward circumstance, and the sailors were not slow in attributing the whole to the influence of the black cat on board. This came to Lord Cochrane's ears, and knowing that any attempt to reason his men out of so absurd a notion was perfectly useless, he offered to sacrifice this object of his regard, and have her thrown overboard. This, however, far from creating any satisfaction, only alarmed the men still more. They were sure that the tempests she would then raise would be much worse than any they had yet encountered, and they implored his lordship to let her remain unmolested. There was no help, and they could only hope. If she were not affronted, they might, at the end of their time, reach England in safety. Black cats were always more especially connected with superstitious feelings, and I was once accosted by a peasant's wife, who, with a phial in her hand to contain it, requested I would give her a few drops of blood from the tail of my black kitten, not only to bring luck to her hearth, but to keep pestilence from her doors. Even lately a working woman told me not to turn a stray black cat from my house, for if I did I should never have any prosperity afterwards. Captain Brown tells us that on Halloween it was usual in Scotland for families to tie up their cat, in order to preserve it from being used as a pony by the witches that night. Those who neglected this precaution ran the risk of seeing their cat scampering through the fields with a witch on its back, on the high road to Norway. A black cat was commonly sacrificed by the ancients to Hecate, or among the Scandinavians to Freya, the northern Hecate. A black cat sent with a prayer book and a bag of sand into a new house, so as to precede the proprietor in possession, was formerly deemed essential to ensure prosperity to the person changing his abode. To steal a black cat and bury it alive is in the Irish Highlands considered as a specific for a disorder in cattle termed blacklegs, which otherwise proves fatal. There is yet another peculiar feeling respecting cats, namely, the strange antipathy which some persons entertain towards them, and is equally unassailable with that of superstition. Of course, in many instances, illness and weak indulgence have greatly increased it, but in some cases it has been unconsciously harbored, and in others unconquerable. A friend of mine told me that through life this feeling had accompanied him, in spite of every endeavor made to eradicate it. When a little boy he awoke one night with that trembling and cold perspiration which always assailed him when a cat was in his vicinity, and, screaming for help, he entreated the servant who entered to take away the cat which was in the room. The man searched, but found no traces of puss. His young master still persisted she was there, but a renewed search proved equally unavailing, nor could he compose himself to rest unless the servant remained in the room till he was asleep. This accomplished, the man left him, and a second time my friend awoke in the same manner, with the same appeals for assistance. They were obeyed, he himself joined in the search, and he dragged out a cat from the close stove, for it was in Germany, which had taken refuge there, and been wholly unperceived by the manservant. This gentleman's daughter inherited the same antipathy, and neither the tenderest feelings towards other dumb creatures, or the strongest efforts of a mind of unusual strength, could subdue the uncomfortable and distressing sensation which thrilled through her when a cat was in her presence. Where every house has a cat, many too, where every female cat, at least twice in each year, brings forth a litter of from 3 to 5 kittens, which are not all drowned, some idea may be formed of the untellable number of cats in London, but it is only the dwellers in what is called a quiet, out-of-the-way street in the metropolis who can form any notion of the noise and caterwaulings of this part of the population. All cats, on first taking possession with their owners of a house, are obliged to enter into an alliance, offensive and defensive, with the older inhabitants of the neighborhood. In some instances the amicable arrangements, though less noisy, are the most troublesome, of which I was convinced in one of my dwellings. The back overlooked a number of gardens, some of which were large, and to enjoy these sufficiently, a small leaded terrace was thrown out from the back drawing room window. Here all the cats of all the gardens, the street, and the opposite square used to hold their conversation, and I presume that my cats were particularly amiable, for often, if the drawing room window had been left open during our absence, we found a select few, perhaps 5 or 6, sitting within its precincts, as if in friendly talk. Every cat that comes to a new area in London appears to me to be obliged to fight till he gains undisturbed possession of it. At least so it has been the case with my cats. A very fine, bold, powerful tabby did this twice with perfect success, but after repeated combats, although victorious, the struggle made him fierce and occasionally sullen. Another, who was a very beautiful creature, but much weaker, used to come in with his handsome ears slit, his cheeks swollen, his fur torn off, his frolic and vivacity gone, and he sat crouching by the fire all day. At night he was roused by the fierce defiance of his enemies, and the contest continued till he died from his exertions. One cat belonging to me had a curious manner of showing her disappointment or anger, whichever it might be, for the instant she was affronted. She walked away and seated herself with her back to the offending parties. A child of hers was an instance of the effect of judicious education, for fair and gentle treatment transformed her from a violent, outrageous kitten to a well-behaved cat, and it was curious to see the instantaneous effect which the voice of his preceptress produced. Cats will learn all sorts of antics, and form all sorts of contradictory attachments, young birds, puppies, rats, and mice frequently being the objects. My mother-in-law had both a favorite canary and an equally beloved cat. The former lived in her bedroom, and when alone she suffered him to fly about the room, for she could there exclude the latter. Chance, however, discovered that Puss was as fond of the canary as she was, and, to her surprise, on raising her head from her work one morning, she saw the bird perched upon the cat's body, without fear, and the cat evidently delighted. After that there was no further restraint, and the two pets were daily companions. Their mistress, however, received another fright, for Puss gave a slight growl, and, seizing the bird in her mouth, leaped on to the bed. Her tail swelled out, her hair erect, and her eyes as big as 4. The bird was of course given up for lost, but the door being accidentally left open, a strange cat had come in, and it was for the preservation of the bird that the cat had seized him, and as soon as the intruder was driven away she set the prisoner at liberty. Cats have often been trained to act as game finders without offering the slightest damage to their capture. They have given the alarm when thieves have been breaking in, and manifested great proofs of reflection and thought, which may be called reason, without degrading the act of the intellect. One belonging to my sister invariably goes to her room when she rings her bell, but does not offer to stir when any other bell in the house is sounded. Another, in the service of a friend, was in the habit of going into the garden, catching a bird, and bringing it to the cook, appearing to ask her to dress it, and yet it was perfectly her own suggestion. A brother of mine had a favorite tortoise-shell cat named Monkey, who always sat on his shoulder when he was shaving, and evinced every sign of deep attachment. He left her under the care of some friends when he went abroad, and 2 years after, these ladies were surprised the evening he was expected home at the extreme restlessness of the animal. She heard the arrival of the carriage at the garden gate before they did, and ere the bell was rung, she was furious to be let out to meet him. Her joy was indescribable, and the next morning she took her place on his shoulder as usual when she saw him prepare his razor. Such attachments have been known to continue after death, and cats have died of grief on their master's grave. I have already noticed a great friendship between a pup dog and a cat, and the following proof of a similar strength of love is taken from the pages of M. Wenzel in his Observations on the Language of Brutes. I had a cat and a dog, which became so attached to each other that they would never willingly be asunder. Whenever the dog got any choice morsel of food, he was sure to divide it with his whiskered friend. They always ate socially out of one plate, slept in the same bed, and daily walked out together. Wishing to put this apparently sincere friendship to the proof, I one day took the cat by herself into my room while I had the dog kept in another apartment. I entertained the cat in a most sumptuous manner, being desirous to see what sort of meal she would make without her friend, who had been hitherto her constant table companion. The cat enjoyed the treat, and seemed entirely to have forgotten the dog. I had had a partridge for dinner, half of which I intended to keep for supper. My wife covered it with a plate, and put it into a cupboard, the door of which she did not lock. The cat left the room, and I walked out on business. My wife meanwhile sat at work in an adjoining apartment. When I returned home, she related to me the following circumstances. The cat, having hastily left the dining room, went to the dog, and mewed unusually loudly, and in different tones, which the dog, from time to time, answered with a short bark. They went together to the door of the room where the cat had dined, and waited till it was opened. The two friends then immediately entered the apartment. My wife rose from her seat, went softly to the door, which stood ajar, to observe what was going on. The cat led the dog to the cupboard, which contained the partridge, pushed off the plate which covered it, and, taking out my intended supper, laid it before her canine friend, who devoured it quickly. The following anecdote almost places the cat on a level with the dog. A physician of Lyons was requested to inquire into a murder that had been committed on a woman of that city. In consequence of this request, he went to the habitation of the deceased, where he found her extended lifeless on the floor, weltering in her blood. A large white cat was mounted on the cornice of a cupboard at the far end of the apartment, where he seemed to have taken refuge. He sat motionless with his eyes fixed on the corpse, and his attitude and looks expressing horror and affright. The following morning he was found in the same situation and attitude, and when the room was filled with officers of justice, neither the clattering of the soldiers' arms nor the loud conversation of the company could in the least degree divert his attention. As soon, however, as the suspected persons were brought in, his eyes glared with increased fury, his hair bristled, he darted into the middle of the apartment, where he stopped for a moment to gaze at them, and then precipitately retreated under the bed. The countenances of the assassins were disconcerted, and they were now, for the first time, abandoned by their audacious atrocity. There are several instances on record of cats finding their way back to their former abodes under circumstances of great difficulty, and the following appears to me to be one of the most striking of them, and quoted from a letter. While driving at Four Paths, Clarendon, Jamaica, I wanted a cat, and had one given to me, which was nearly full grown. It was brought from Morgan's Valley estate, where it was bred, and had never been removed from that place before. The distance was 5 miles. It was put into a canvas bag and carried by a man on horseback. Between the two places there are 2 rivers, one of them about 80 feet broad and 2 feet and a half deep, running strong. The other is wider and more rapid, but less deep. Over these rivers are no bridges. The cat was shut up at Four Paths for some days, and when considered to be reconciled to her new dwelling, she was allowed to go about the house. The day after obtaining her liberty she was missing, and upon my next visiting the estate she was brought from, I was quite amazed to learn that the cat had come back again. Did she swim over the rivers at the fords where the horse came through with her, or did she ascend the banks for a considerable distance in search of a more shallow place, and where the stream was less powerful? At all events, she must have crossed the rivers in opposition to her natural habits. A singular malformation in the cat has been perpetuated, till a race of tailless cats is now in existence, and which is certainly no improvement on the original stock; for nothing can be more graceful than the attitudes of the cat's tail, or more expressive of its feelings of joy or anger. Section 7